Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Lily Chang. I serve as the founding director for the Chinese Cultural Center at San Diego State University. I also serve as the chair of the board for the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum. I'm honored today to present to you a wonderful presentation about the Zodiac heads from the Garden of Perfect Brightness, Yuan Mingyuan, and the negotiation of cultural heritage. This will be presented by Professor Patricia Yu. But before we start the presentation, we do have a few announcements. I will serve as the moderator for today's session. The museum will be having a book club, our book club meeting on October 28th. The book is Rabbit on a Bumpy Road. It is written by Tom Hom. Both Tom Hom and Loretta Hom will be there. On November 18th, we will have Snuff Bottles from San Diego by Claire Chu. Next, please. We also, at the museum, will be presenting on October 28th and 29th, 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. our Asian Scary Theater at the Chung Garden behind the museum's mission building. Next. We want to thank PLUS Charitable Trust and the S. Xu family for their generous contribution to support this program. I'm inviting Yudan Wang to talk about the San Diego State University's program.
Good morning. My name is Yudan Wang from San Diego State University Chinese Culture Center. I'm so excited to announce upcoming events from the Chinese Culture Center. In the months of October, November, we are having an exhibit about Chinese acupuncture. The name is Acupuncture Journey to the United States. It's on the campus in our center. It's the PSFA 130. We have more detail on our website. Next program is the monthly program, Kung Fu Workshop. It's every month from October, November to December. And we have details on the website as well. It's by the Kung Fu Master Paul Liu, and we are at the center have hold this program, the workshop. Thank you, and I'm gonna have my the website on the chat box. Now I'm gonna announce the guidelines for today's Zoom program. After presentation, if you have a comment or question, you may raise your Zoom hand or write your question in the chat box. Our co-host Elizabeth will call on your name when it's your turn. And before the program starts, we'll take a group picture. And please turn your camera on just before the beginning of the lecture. And after the group picture, we're gonna have our lecture start. Please turn your microphone and your camera off. And now I think it's good time for our group picture. Okay, we'll have all our Muti, would you please just let the spotlight off so we can have everyone here? Okay. 1, 2, 3, smile. Beautiful. I have one more. 1, 2, 3. Smile. Beautiful. Thank you so much. And I'm gonna turn back to Dr. Lily.
Yes. So today's presentation is going to be presented by Dr. Yu Jingge, Patricia Yu. She is currently an assistant professor of art history at Kenyon College. She received her PhD in art history at the University of California, Berkeley. I myself serve as the chairman of the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum and also the founding director of the San Diego State Chinese Cultural Center. Our discussant will be also from Ohio State University. He's a doctoral student of art history. So let's put our hands together and welcome Dr. Patricia Yu.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm so pleased to be joining this group today. Thank you to San Diego State University and the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum for inviting me. Thank you, Lily, for that very kind introduction and also for welcoming me back to give this talk. I think I've seen some of you guys last year when I was a discussant for a different talk in this lecture series. I wish I was able to be there in sunny San Diego in person, but I'm zooming in to you from my office at Kenyon College. I'm particularly pleased to be presenting my research to the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum and your guests, because Chinese historical museums in general have been a very important part of my own career development. I don't think I would be in this field of art history if it were not for an early undergraduate internship with the Chinese American Museum of Los Angeles back when I was a wee baby undergrad. So now I'm a Californian expat here in Ohio. And I'm very excited to kind of tell the story about the lives and the afterlives of this specific set of fragmented bronze sculptural heads from the ruins of the Yuanmingyuan, and the ways in which these particular heads kind of spawn new objects and meanings through their reproductions. So we're actually going to begin this story not in the Yuanmingyuan itself, but actually in Taiwan. So next slide, please. Thank you. On December 28th, 2015, then Taiwan President Ma Ying-jeou and Hong Kong superstar Jackie Chan struck martial arts poses in the central courtyard of the South Branch of the National Palace Museum in Jiayi, Taiwan. So during this opening ceremony for the new branch museum, the museum unveiled Jackie Chan's donation to the museum. 12 heads of the Chinese Zodiac installed in the museum's central courtyard. Next slide. And not 2 days later, on December 30th, 2 student activists entered the museum and they dumped red paint all over 2 of the heads, the dragon and the horse. and they spray painted Cultural United Front on the concrete pedestal, transforming this sculptural installation into an impromptu stele of protest. They publicly posted the photograph of their protest to social media on Facebook, where I saw it, along with a statement denouncing this new museum's seeming betrayal of its founding principles. But why target these Zodiac sculptures? They seem pretty innocuous. What kind of heavy symbolic weight do they carry that could arouse such fervent reactions? What do these zodiac animals have to do with cross-strait relations? So to answer this initial question, let us go to the next slide, because the heads in the museum central courtyard are not just any heads, but they are reproductions of the 12 zodiac animal heads in the Yueming Yuan, in the Garden of Perfect Brightness. So we're going to kind of take a little trip back to the Yueming Yuan's initial creation, its destruction, where these heads were in the garden, and their fate in contemporary cultural heritage discourse. So I'm going to be trying to answer this question of why these heads. What is it about this particular set of objects, more so than all of the many other things that are from the Yueming Yuan, that has inspired such discussion, such debate, such controversy in the topic of the repatriation of Chinese cultural heritage objects? And then I will turn to the ways in which the story of the zodiac heads doesn't just end with their repatriation back to China, but actually continues in its multiple sculptural reproductions, such as the ones we just saw in Taiwan, as well as other examples. And we'll kind of be thinking about these reproductions not as exact copies, they're not strict replications, but to think about them as acts of translation that literally moves things into different spatial and site-specific contexts, but also translation in the sense that it allows for new discussions, for new audiences regarding questions about cultural heritage, identity, traditions, and perhaps even global justice. So in the sort of towards the end of this talk, we'll think about how these acts of reproductive translation can elevate the originals, make fun of them, or even inspire, as we just saw, acts of vandalism. Next slide, please. So we're going to start at the height of the Qing conquest empire. So this is the last imperial dynasty of China, starting in 1644, lasting until 1912. We can see that at the height of its height in the 18th century, that this is a conquest empire that has greatly expanded the boundaries of the empire, all the way, from the northeastern Manchu homelands down to the Himalayas, from the Mongolian steppes to the seaports of Canton. We've got this very large, expansive, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual empire. Next slide. So it's in this kind of multicultural context, in the both in the imperial workshops in Beijing, where we see the artworks produced through this moment of cross-cultural encounter. I have an example here of this ewer made in the 18th century through the integration of artistic techniques brought in by European Jesuit court artists that produce these visual effects of the Qing court, as well as if we go down to the Canton seaports, we also have intense cross-cultural interaction in this moment here too, with all of the export art that is being produced for global trade. Next slide. So it's in this context of the Qing Empire, of cross-cultural exchange, that we that the Yuanmingyuan is being constructed, right? Here we're looking at a slide where we're just sort of showing that diversity of court painting, particularly the different faces of the Qianlong emperor, the man who will be responsible for constructing large parts of the Yuanmingyuan. Here, where he's really kind of showing the different aspects to his own identity as an emperor who has to rule over this multi-ethnic realm, showing himself as a literati scholar, as a universal ruler and warrior, and also placing himself within that tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. So let's go into the Yuanmingyuan. Next slide. All right, so if we can just sort of orient ourselves a little bit, you can see that down in the lower right-hand side, that is the Forbidden City in Beijing. And if we go up about 5 kilometers or so into the northwest, we find the Yuanmingyuan, or the Garden of Perfect Brightness, first established in 1709, and then continuously kind of expanded throughout the 18th century. Next. All right. So if you have been to the Yuanmingyuan recently, you will know that it currently lies in ruins. We do have a series of paintings that were done in the 18th century by court artists that show us the kind of 40 select scenes of the Yuanmingyuan that show the kind of diversity of Chinese architecture and landscape design within this site. This painting album itself is one of the works looted from the Yuanmingyuan in 1860. It currently is part of the collection of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Next. Okay, so where are the zodiac heads actually located? So if we are looking at this plan of the Yuanmingyuan and we look up into that northeastern corner, we see this T-shaped strip of land that was developed in the decades between 1747 and 1783 on this 19-acre strip. And so this section that is designed by the court European Jesuits is a relatively small part of the overall Yuanmingyuan complex. And of course, today it also lies in ruins. Next. Now, fortunately for us, we do know what this site largely would have looked like because its image is preserved in a set of 20 copper plate prints made by a Manchu court artist in the 1780s. Here we can see the ways in which this design incorporates European Baroque architectural style and fountain work here at the scene of the Great Fountains. Next slide. And if you can see where I have circled in red down at the bottom here, that's where the zodiac heads actually are. So we're moving away from, we're still in that site of the European palaces. We're no longer in the scene of the Great Fountains, but we've sort of shifted over a little bit. And I'll show you what that looks like in the next slide. Yes, so here we are in front of the Hall of Calm Seas, where we can see that the bronze animal heads are actually installed as fountain heads in front of this large clock fountain. I think my next slide has a closer view of the heads. There we go. Okay, so we have the heads as not just heads by themselves, but heads with bodies and functioning as a clock, actually. That what's kind of really fun about this fountain is that every 2 hours, a different animal would spout out water. And then at noon, all of the animals will spout water at once. But if you were to go to the European palaces today in the Yuanmingyuan, next slide, you will not find those heads there. That this is a site now in ruins. We can see that the archway of the Great fountains as kind of the blocks have been put back together. So we do get some sense of architectural form, but that other picture next to it, we can still see the clamshell from the Hall of Calm Seas fountain, but none of the animals are there anymore. That sort of standing archway is now the most recognizable part of the Yuanmingyuan. Its form forms the logo of the Yuanmingyuan Ruins Park. And the little trash cans around the park as well are made in the shape of that archway. So we can also think about the ways in which surviving fragments start to take over the identity of an original space. That I have heard many times people say to me, oh, Yuanmingyuan, that's the European garden. And that's not entirely true, right? As we just saw, that the European palaces only form this very small part of the overall complex, but because their ruins are the fragments that are still surviving, that kind of starts to overwrite that identity of the garden. Next slide. So, what happened to the fountain and to the heads? Well, they're going to be separated from their bodies at the conclusion of the Second Opium War. Now, the Treaty of Tianjin had officially ended this war in 1858, but delays in its ratification resulted in the combined forces of the British and the French under the command of Lord Elgin. By the way, this Lord Elgin is the son of the other Lord Elgin who took the Parthenon marbles that are now in the British Museum. So there's a little bit of a shared family history here. That the Anglo-French troops marched towards Beijing to force ratification. And when they encamped at the Yuanmingyuan in October of 1860, by this time, the garden was kind of empty, mostly empty of people. The emperor was not there. And this resulted in days of looting and then setting fire to the garden. Next slide. Oh, thank you. The destruction of this garden was actually greeted with a lot of ambivalence in Europe. The French novelist Victor Hugo, who himself was very interested in the preservation of French cultural heritage and identity, lamented the destruction of the Yuanmingyuan. And in his own writing, he actually really elevates the Yuanmingyuan, the Garden of Perfect Brightness, into the company of the greatest monuments of classical and medieval antiquity, even though the Yuanmingyuan itself is only about a century and a half old at this point. But he writes that there was, in a corner of the world, a wonder of the world. This wonder was called the Summer Palace, or the Yuanmingyuan. People spoke of the Parthenon in Greece, the pyramids in Egypt, the Colosseum in Rome, Notre Dame in Paris, the Summer Palace in the Orient. This wonder has disappeared. One day, two bandits entered the Summer Palace, one plundered, the other burned. What was done to the Parthenon was done to the Summer Palace more thoroughly, and that nothing of it should be left. We Europeans are the civilized ones, and for us, the Chinese are the barbarians. This is what civilization has done to barbarism. However, for Lord Elgin, in his opinion, it was the Qing government that was the barbarian by failing to abide by still uncodified standards of wartime conduct and treatment of captives. So this is Elgin's reason for why he burned down the Yuanmingyuan. Weeks before burning down the Yuanmingyuan, in one of the encounters between the Anglo-French troops and Qing troops, 39 civilian negotiators and soldiers had been seized by Qing soldiers in September. And by the time they were returned back to the British-French troops in October, many of them had actually died. And of those who came back alive, they testified to the horrifying conditions of their captivity, that they were starved and beaten and neglected. And so Elgin's decision to burn down the Yuanmingyuan was justified in this letter to their superiors, where he claimed that the prisoners of war were treated with a great deal of barbarity, that they had nothing to eat or drink, that the English nation needed to kind of respond to the barbarous manner in which the Qing Empire has, quote, violated the laws of nations. So in Elgin's perspective, he saw the deprivations that his men suffered as, frankly, as a war crime, and that therefore some sort of justice needed to be served out, right? That the man responsible, the emperor, needed to be punished. But the emperor is not here, so his garden has to serve as a substitute. One of Elgin's subordinates would later say that, quote, from an artistic point of view, burning down the Yuanmingyuan was an act of vandalism. From that of sound policy, it was statesmanlike. So what is being destroyed here isn't just the physical landscape of the garden, but that whole imperial aura of the Yuanmingyuan, and with it the aura of Qing imperial authority. And so we can kind of think about Elgin sort of here acting as like judge, jury, and executioner in this case. Next slide. So what happened to all of the loot taken from the Yuanmingyuan? Much of the works were exhibited back in London and in France. We can see here this page from the Illustrated London News that shows the display of looted objects, particularly those that are big, hefty, relate to imperial power and prestige, or relate to military power and prestige. There's no sign here of the animal, of the Zodiac animal heads. In fact, the only actual animal that makes it, that we have the story of what happened to it is an actual little dog, this little Pekingese dog named, that was then given the name Ludi and gifted to Queen Victoria, who had its portrait taken. And in this painted portrait, you can see the emphasis on the tiny, delicate Chinese dog situated next to a delicate, brittle piece of porcelain. Supposedly, Ludi had a very hard time adjusting to life in England and didn't really fully acclimate to being surrounded by all the other English dogs. Next slide. Many of the objects taken from the Yuanmingyuan were also given to Empress Eugenie in France, where she stored them in the Chinese museum, the Musée Chinois, at her palace in Fontainebleau. And you can see that in this photograph of that Chinese museum, that there has been a bit of creative reimagining of some of those objects. That right in that center, that cloisonné incense censer, which is part of a pear, that its buddy is no longer next to it on the floor, but has been transformed into a chandelier that hangs from the ceiling. So we are kind of here seeing the ways in which these looted goods are also serving as ways for French and European monarchs to kind of creatively engage with the spoils of their empires. Okay. Oh, it's so lovely how you are anticipating my slides. So yeah, so in the writing of modern Chinese history, the looting and burning of the Yuanmingyuan came to be viewed as an insult, not specifically against the Qing Manchu emperor, but actually as an insult against the Chinese people and the new Chinese nation, to be remembered as national humiliation during a century of humiliations that stretch from the Opium Wars to the Second World War. It's within this discourse of national humiliation that an author of a 1931 article in the Journal of the Chinese Architecture Society, where the destruction of the Yuanmingyuan is described as vandalism. Quote, destroyed by Western vandalism, this is a great loss to Chinese culture, and it is the first of that which our fellow countrymen must never forget. Since the time of Sino-Western encounter and exchange, Western vandalism has brought disaster upon China, of which this campaign was the first and greatest. And what interests me here is that vandalism shows up here both in a transliterated form as fanda, but also is printed directly into the text in English, which really calls attention to it as an imported foreign concept. So that it almost makes it seem as if vandalism is something that, didn't happen until the foreigners showed up in China. And of course, by characterizing the destruction of the Yuanmingyuan as vandalism, our author here is also drawing attention to the origins of this term in the sacking of Rome by the Vandals. So kind of drawing this historic parallel between centuries-old civilizations that have been brought down by foreign invasion. I also sort of like the choice of transliteration here of vandalism as fan da, where we have fan meaning foreign and then da to arrive, so that then when we put this together, like vandalism is something that happens when the foreigners come. Later in the same article, our author will also call out the international community for an inconsistent application of principles regarding cultural heritage preservation. This author later says that when Germany invaded Belgium in 1914 and bombed the Leuven Library, this act was condemned by all nations, end quote. And so, where was the outrage when the Yuanmingyuan was vandalized? And he is writing in 1931. And so this is the same year that the Athens conference, one of these big kind of international conventions, is called, that was really calling for the preservation of historic sites. So we have here an author who I think is quite aware of that frustrating contradiction between the rhetoric of historic preservation that is arising now in the early 20th century, but coming too late for the protection of the Yuanmingyuan decades earlier. Next slide. So the ruins of the Yuanmingyuan have featured in this national humiliation narrative since the early 20th century, where its ruined fragments point to also the fragmented body of the nation. In the post-Mao period, the Zodiac heads are really stars of the conversation regarding the repatriation and recovery of looted cultural heritage relics. But what happened to them between 1860 and 2000? They're sort of largely, don't really make a ripple. They have almost no history. They're nearly forgotten. And even though Yuanmingyuan looted goods were immediately on the market, displayed and auctioned in the aftermath of the looting of the Yuanmingyuan, those bronze heads themselves don't appear. In fact, between 1860 and 1987, they functionally aren't in the historic record at all. And they don't appear again until the late 1980s. Next. So when do they come back to our notice? We start in 1987 in October when Sotheby's New York is auctioning the heads of the monkey and the pig. And according to the auction catalog, these heads had supposedly been exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum in New York in 1980 and 1981. And I thought this was fascinating. So I went to the Met Museum's annual reports to see if they're mentioned, and they're not mentioned at all. I asked the then curators there if they knew about this, and all of the curators of Chinese art don't even remember that they were there. So it turns out that these heads were never actually exhibited at the Met. The collector had hoped that the museum might acquire them. And so at some point they were kind of left in the care of the Department of Decorative Arts of European decorative arts as a potential acquisition, but no one at the time was interested in acquiring them. And it had nothing to do with the questionable provenance of these items. Provenance here meaning that history of ownership. It was mostly just decided that they didn't really fit into the museum's collection. They were curiosities, they weren't significant artworks, they didn't really fit neatly into the Department of European Decorative Art, but also didn't fit neatly into the East Asian Art Department. So the museum decided not to acquire them, which is why they're here on the auction block, getting sold to an American collector for about $100,000 and then being sold to a Taiwanese collector for about $165,000. Next. So in 1989, that same Taiwan collector, who's the founder of the gallery My Humble House, acquired 3 more heads at a Christie's London sale. The ox for $240,000, the tiger for $223,000, the horse for $294,000. So actually at this point in 1989, 4 heads are actually in Taiwan. Next. And My Humble House went on to actually make 100 copies of the monkey head in bronze to sell them as collectibles. If anyone has one of these, I would love to know how you got them. I was not able to find records of copies of any of the other heads being made, so presumably this actually wasn't a huge collector's item. And not long afterwards, the same Taiwan dealer put the heads back up for sale. Next. So those 2 earlier sales in 1987 and 1989 were pretty quiet, but this wasn't the case in 2000 at these almost back-to-back sales at Christie's Hong Kong and Sotheby's Hong Kong. By this point, the Chinese government and pro-Beijing groups are lobbying to have the sales halted. Protesters actually stormed the Sotheby's sale room at the Island Shangri-La Hotel. Kind of coincidentally, the sales room was located next to the hotel restaurant, which was called the Summer Palace. But the sales went ahead nonetheless. And rather than resorting to legal or diplomatic action, China nonetheless recovered 3 of the heads by just buying them back. So the Poly Art Group, which is an arts and culture offshoot of the People's Liberation Army, actually just went ahead and spent nearly about $1 million for the monkey and the ox, and almost $2 million for the tiger. So what was very difficult to be done through diplomatic or legal means actually could be solved just by throwing money at the problem and just purchasing the objects back, and also demonstrating the success of China's economic restructuring in the post-Mao years. Next. As an example, in the intersection between patriotism, repatriation, and strategic business dealings, in 2003, the so-called gambling king of Macau, Mr. Stanley Ho, purchased the pig in New York for $770,000 and then donated it to the Poly Art Museum. 4 years later, he will also purchase the horse head for $8.9 million. So look at the inflation value of these works, which actually, to avoid the controversy of a sale of an object of looted provenance, ended up actually being a private transaction between Stanley Ho and the consignor of the horse head. Now, as he did before, Stanley Ho donated the horse back to the Chinese nation, but he actually kept it on display in his casino in Macau. It won't be until December of 2020 that the horse head is actually returned back to the Yuanming Yuan. Now, when Stanley Ho purchased the horse head and gifted it back to the nation, the Ministry of Cultural Relics lauded him for his patriotic act, and perhaps it is entirely coincidental that Stanley Ho's casino business ventures were at a rather shaky point at this time. So I'm sure he also had many other benefits from this act of great patriotism. Next. So at this point in our story, the pig, the monkey, the ox, and the tiger are in the Poly Art Museum in Beijing, where you can see them today. And you can also buy many replicas of them in this museum's souvenir gift shop. Next. So we come to our last two heads. In 2009, the rat and the rabbit came up for auction at Christie's Paris from the estate of the fashion designer Yves Saint Laurent. But the person who won the bid at a staggering $18 million US per head, this is a Xiamen-based businessman and collector, he then refused to pay, claiming that, of course, that objects that were illegally taken from China should just be repatriated. So the heads remained in the collection of Pierre Berger, who was the partner of Yves Saint Laurent, who made a public statement saying that, like, well, he'll return the heads when China addresses human rights violations in Tibet. So we have, multiple intersections of this conversation between repatriation and human rights and kind of cultural heritage preservation and international politics and economy. Now, to further this intersection point between cultural heritage, global politics, and the economy, the French luxury business magnate, Francois-Henri Pinault. Oh, I see I have a typo here. That should say Pinault and not Pierre Berger in 2013. He ends up acquiring the rat and the rabbit, and he actually gives as a gift the heads back to China during a diplomatic trip in 2013 to broaden trade relations between the two countries. Next. So we come back to our question about why these specific heads and why do they arouse such kind of intense debate and emotion in the post-2000s era, right? And we can kind of start to answer this question by thinking about the big picture of nation states competing with each other in the cultural heritage realm that there wants to be the conferral of political legitimacy by casting a state's lineage back in time, by creating connections between the present and the objects of the past, that claims for repatriation are also about the flexing of political power. We might also think about the continuation of the narrative of national humiliation since the early 20th century, particularly in the period after the Tiananmen Square incident of 1989, where that narrative of national humiliation is revived in national pedagogy to bolster nationalism and patriotism among the youth. And also that part of this is the establishment of the Yuanmingyuan Ruins Park in the early 1980s, which a park that was then opened to the public in 1988. And in 1994, the Yuanmingyuan Ruins Park was designated a patriotic education base. It was the site of celebration in 1997 with the repatriation of Hong Kong, so the reconstitution of a fragmented national body. By the mid-1990s, that section of the European palaces had been cleaned up. And so the image of its ruins came to be symbolic of the Yuanmingyuan as a whole. So we can kind of see how the Yuanmingyuan really re-enters back into the national conversation in the late 1980s. But we still want to come back to this question about why these particular works though, because so many things were taken from the Yuanmingyuan: paintings, porcelain, jades, robes. So why these objects, these so-called least imperial works, these fountains, spouts? What is it about these heads that is so kind of evocative and attracts our attention? And I would like to propose that it's because they're heads. That one, unlike works of porcelain or jade that are very mobile, that these heads are so closely associated with the Yuanmingyuan. We know exactly where they were located. We know exactly what they served as. And also what I think is really important is that they form a set. We can look at the slide here and we can kind of immediately see that there are figures that are missing. We don't have the dragon, the snake, the ram, the rooster, the dog. It's easy to kind of think about like, okay, that somehow the recovery of the set as a whole makes it feel like all the pieces have been put back together. But here we don't have all the pieces. It can't be put all back together. We can almost imagine these animal figures that we all each have a personal connection to, right? Like, what year of the animal are you? They almost seem like kind of missing posters or those missing faces on milk cartons. And finally, like as heads, they make us think about decapitation. That we have this imagined moment of their heads getting chopped off from their bodies, even though we actually have no historic record of how the heads were actually removed from the bodies. But they look like they have been put on the executioner's block. And so, I think within this narrative of national humiliation, that there is a resonance here between the form of these sculptures as heads without bodies and all of those other images of decapitation, particularly the decapitation of Boxer rebels during the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. Next slide. And I've deliberately decided not to actually show you the images of the decapitated heads, as they're quite disturbing. But we should know that the photographing of decapitation, of bodily punishment, kind of forms a group of images relating to the penetration into Chinese spaces by foreign powers from that entire period, from the Opium Wars to the Boxer Rebellion, to the first Sino-Japanese and later Russo-Japanese War as well. And so that we have all of these images that's circulating of fallen Chinese bodies, imprisoned bodies, subjugated bodies, decapitated heads that are circulating in these souvenir photo albums. And for intellectuals of the late Qing and early Republic, they're really going to kind of seize upon this motif of decapitation, of the fragmented Chinese body, to like make for calls for reform to strengthen the national body. Next. And so this narrative of national humiliation kind of continues into the present moment. If you are in the National Museum of China, in their permanent exhibition for Road to Rejuvenation, you will actually find the heads of the rabbit and the rat placed directly under photographs of Chinese soldiers being beheaded during the First Sino-Japanese War, as well as under photographs of soldiers from the Eight Powers Allied Expeditionary Force sitting upon the Dragon Throne in their invasion of Beijing. And so we have here this very physical installation that creates a connection between literal decapitation and the heads of the Zodiac. So these heads remain a broken and fragmented set. We don't know where the remaining 5 heads are, or if they even still exist. So to kind of fill in the blanks of this fragmented set kind of requires acts of imagination. And so in this next section, I kind of want to end this talk by looking at some examples of Zodiac head reproduction. And here I think I'm using reproduction in a biological sense, that what we're going to see following are not exact copies, not exact replicas, and they're not clones of the originals, but they are almost like children that have resulted from the originals. They share a lot of characteristics with the original Yuanmingyuan heads, but they are themselves their own objects and speak in their own voices. And so we, in kind of looking at these other acts of reproduction and translation, we can see how there are additional layers now to discuss through the negotiation of cultural heritage in the 21st century. Next. So in the aftermath of that 2009 Christie's auction of the rat and rabbit head, a few different projects were sort of instigated. One was by Ai Weiwei, the noted artist, activist, iconoclast, whose other works very much do question the value of Chinese cultural heritage and its objects, that he's very well known for his works of dropping a Han Dynasty vase, of painting over Neolithic pottery, of many engagements with the forms and materials of the past. Next. And at the time of that 2009 auction, he was already in discussions to create a work of public sculpture. And so then that controversy over the auctioning of the rat and the rabbit inspired his monumental sculptural project, Circle of Animals, bronze series, which reproduces the Yuanmingyuan bronzes as very, very large scale works. And so as an act of artistic translation, it's not a copy, it's not a replica. It largely follows the form of what those heads look like, but make them really, really big, places them on top of these thin columns of bronze, and has to creatively imagine what those missing animals might have looked like. Also, these new heads are not actually fountain heads. They don't spout water, but they are often installed next to fountains or in fountains to create that further connection to the original. Next. But Ai Weiwei very much questions the value of these heads. In his own blog post from 2009, he says that, quote, the rabbit and rat bronzes from the old summer palace are not Chinese culture, and they have no artistic value. Patriotism is not a love of the Qing ruling house, and 12 playthings manufactured in the West are not the quintessence of Chinese culture. Over the first few decades of a new China, in the name of the revolution and during the Cultural Revolution across the entire nation and in Tibet, you destroyed countless cultural relics, so on and so forth. And if we're looking at these heads, we have kind of this question of representation. The exhibition catalog for these works describes the heads as being carried up on a column of water in a, quote, spirit of playfulness that kind of refers to their initial position as fountainheads. An art review in the New York Times presents the suggestion that it looks like the heads are on lotus stems and leaves that further makes the connection between waters and fountains and gardens. But they also look a lot like decapitated heads on sticks, sort of like a grisly scene out of Lord of the Flies. So there is, I think, an ambivalence here in this sculptural set. Is this a condemnation of the looting of the Yuanmingyuan? Is this a skewering of their value as cultural heritage? Is this about the inflation of their value? Or is it just simply a bunch of playful animals? Next. Now, beginning in 2011, the Circle of Animals sculptural sets went on an international tour. This coincides with Ai Weiwei's own arrest and detainment in Beijing, so that as these heads begin to move around the world, they actually also started to carry the meaning of being a substitute body for the detained artist Ai Weiwei. And as public sculpture, they're not tied to any one specific site, but they really kind of call attention to where they are positioned. And so each installation venue kind of allows the heads to address and confront different concerns. I'm not going to go through every single one of these tour stops because then we'll be here forever, but I'll just go through a few of them. So right here, we see them in front of Somerset House in London, which was the seat of the British Admiralty in 1860. So they kind of almost seem like a parody of war loot on display in the aftermath of conquest. Next. Here they are in front of the formerly Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton, where we might wonder if they're making a critique of American politics, but also that here, seeing them in the summer, that they just sort of seem like kind of curious artifacts that the little children splashing in front of the fountains pay no real attention to. Next. In the courtyards of encyclopedic art museums, such as the Cleveland Museum of Art, they celebrate a famous contemporary artist's new work of art, but also maybe point towards the questionable provenance and acquisition of Asian art in European and American institutions. Next. Great, yes, where the bodiless heads of the Zodiacs seem to also point towards the headless bodies and bodiless heads of Buddhist sculptures that have been chipped away from cave temples and sites in the name of academic study. Next. In front of the National Museum of Wildlife Art, the heads seem to call our attention to animal extinction and to the natural world, to evoke the sense of formerly large herds of megafauna that used to wander North America, to offer a warning about climate change and the threatening and potential extinction of wildlife. Next. And then in front of the Adler Planetarium in Chicago, the heads make a connection towards their astronomical purpose of kind of charting the heavens and the passage of time, but also they were covered up with white cloths in a way for the museum to express solidarity with Ai Weiwei's arrest and silencing. And so that these muzzled and blinded animals then call attention to Ai Weiwei's own restriction of movement and speech. Next. And when Ai Weiwei got his passport back in 2015 and was finally able to travel with the animals, he was first able to do so when they were exhibited here in Prague, where now he is explicitly connecting the heads to the Syrian refugee crisis by wrapping them in the gold foil of emergency blankets that were being used by the refugees. And so here the heads are not Ai Weiwei's substitute body, but the substitute bodies of refugees. Next. And they continue to be reiterated in Ai Weiwei's own artwork here as a series of Lego sculptures that kind of point towards his use of the Lego medium for portraits of political prisoners and imprisoned human rights activists. Next. And finally, that connection between Ai Weiwei's own body and the heads as kind of surrogate identities is further driven home in the upcoming publication of his graphic novel memoir. Next. So we'll turn away from Ai Weiwei now and come back to Taiwan and to Jackie Chan, where Jackie Chan's response to that 2009 auction was to play to his own strengths and to direct and star in the movie Chinese Zodiac. He later then made copies of the movie props and gave them as gifts to other museums, such as that in Taiwan. Next. And so we come back to that act of vandalism, where our student activists are really kind of making a claim for Taiwanese a specifically Taiwanese identity that is distinct from that of mainland China's. And so for Ai Weiwei, he criticized those heads as being like not actually Chinese. But then in that space of a museum in Taiwan, our student activists are criticizing the heads for being too Chinese, that this was not the appropriate space in which to display objects from the Qing Conquest Empire. And you can see in their statement that they are feeling that the museum really should be more focused on Taiwanese culture rather than focusing on the culture of mainland China. Next. And this is, of course, in that context that so their vandalism was in 2015, and this is in the context of student movements across Taiwan that were really about this negotiation of identity within Taiwan itself, about whether it should be kind of more closely aligned with that of mainland China, or if there should be an argument for a independent Taiwanese identity. Next. And finally, we'll just end on some puns, right? That animal heads, to be decapitated, to accept things, all sound the same of shou-shou. And so to accept animal heads seems to be like to accept submission, to accept decapitation. Next slide. And further punning on the names of President Ma Ying-jeou and Jackie Chan, Chen Long, so that it is targeted that the vandalism is on the heads of the horse and the dragon. Next slide. So I'll just conclude by saying that the museum actually very much responded to this act of vandalism. They removed the heads, so now they're no longer present within that central space of the museum. And I think it really calls our attention to these questions about how do institutions respond to challenges, and how do we continue to think about what is given value within museum spaces and who those spaces are for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Patricia Yu, for this absolutely amazing presentation. Now it gives me great pleasure to welcome our discussant, Li Yifan, to join us. Yes, please, go ahead, Yifan.
Oh, hi, can you hear me, Lily? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Lily, and hello everyone from Columbus, Ohio. My name is Yifan Li, and my research specializes in the history of modern Chinese art and visual culture. First, I would like to thank Patricia for kindly inviting me to serve as her discussant today, and for a great, brilliant, thought-provoking talk. And I want to say thank you to friends and colleagues at San Diego Chinese Historical Museum and the Chinese Culture Center at San Diego State University for organizing this great lecture series. I look forward to meeting you in person in my next visit to San Diego. By the way, my zodiac animal is horse, in case you're curious, and because we were talking about zodiac animals. And I also did some research that make me figure out that Jackie Chan or Chen Long is also a horse. So obviously he doesn't have to be associated with President Ma Ying-jeou to become an embodiment of the auspicious meaning of 龙马精神 or 龙马精神. To echo one of the stunning linguistic puns in Patricia's talk, as a Chinese national and a scholar of Chinese art myself, I thought I had known a lot about the Yuan zodiac hats. Growing up in China in the 1990s and early 2000s, I was so familiar with the dominant discourse surrounding these objects as a mature reminder of the national humiliation in the face of Western imperialism in late Qing, as well as newly invented emblem of patriotism at the turn of the 21st century. I periodically read about the sensational news of the hats being auctioned. I also had the opportunity to view one iteration of Ai Weiwei's Circle of Animals sets earlier this year at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art on a rainy afternoon. Honestly, I would have appreciated the weather of the day if I were aware of the zodiac hat's association with water at that time. After hearing Patricia's talk today, I began to realize that the familiarity of the subject that I overconfidently believed that I had terribly oversimplifies the complexity and nuances of these multi-layered histories and meanings. The zodiac hats are not archaic, dead objects from the remote dynastic China. They are, as I would like to call, a communicational device that spatially connects different geopolitical regions and temporally links various historical moments in not only Chinese history, but also world history. They possess this kind of almost magical open-endedness in response to new circumstances and to unforeseen social relations. They provoke reconsideration of our contemporary discussion of issues like cultural heritage and its preservation, the reinterpretation of the past, and the service of new sociopolitical agendas under new circumstances, as well as the formation and operation of Chinese cultural identity, both within China and in the Chinese diaspora, or as some scholars would call it, the Sinophone world. Patricia's meticulous research also convincingly answers or proposes thoughtful insights to the recurring question addressed in her talk, why these hats? Or to elaborate for me, why are we still looking at the Yuan Zodiac hats in 2023? As someone who is also interested in Qing Dynasty art and its afterlives, I have learned a lot from Patricia's expert contextualization of historical events, precise analysis of archival sources, and careful attention to the details of visual materials. I'm so jealous of her students at Kin. I have to say, I wish I could have a teacher this good in college. In my discussion, I have decided not to summarize the content of her well-organized and lucidly delivered talk. Instead, I will tease out three interlaced terms or themes or analytic lenses that figure prominently in her research, which work in tandem with each other to help us better understand the intricate meaning devised in these zodiac hats and their reproductions at different historical moments. Also, I think these terms or themes vividly showcase the continuity and consistency of certain practices and mindsets surrounding the subject across time and space. One of my favorite terms is from the title of this presentation, negotiation. And I would like to tell you that this is a term that I personally use a lot in my own research. As I understand it, negotiation in this case means that the meanings and significance of this set of zodiac hats, along with the sociopolitical relations and power dynamics built upon them, are not stable, not static. There's always space for change and adjustment. It is fascinating to see how these meanings and relations are often manipulated, constructed, and reconstructed by different parties to serve different purposes, including individuals like Ai Weiwei and students activists in Taiwan, as well as political entities like the Qing Empire and the PRC government. And oftentimes, we find that the negotiation is operated at the cost of privileged economic, political, or intellectual capitals. For example, you need a great deal of money to bid and win an original hat and donate it back to China like Stanley Ho did. But I bet he had won a lot better in return, a lot more in return, I mean. Another example is the vandalism happened in Jiayi, Taiwan. It is through this radical practice of destroy that new meanings are being constructed. The second term that I would like to highlight is translation, which inherently is a means of negotiation. Patricia introduced this term in her discussion of artistic reproductions of the animal heads, or I think she called them babies of the original heads. Oh, I really like that metaphor. Please allow me to pick up her eloquent words here As translations, the new sets of hats give voice to questions about heritage, identity, traditions, and even global justice. So we should consider how these acts of translation or reproduction can elevate the originals, satirize them, or inspire acts of vandalism. The reproduction, in this case, is not a mechanical replica of the so-called original. It comes with its own voice and agency. This novel interpretation, I found it just extremely inspiring. And I believe it will critically reshape our understanding of reproduction or cultural legacy in artistic practices. Here, I also wanted to acknowledge that I extremely appreciate Patricia's skillful reading of multiple iterations of Ai Weiwei's Circle of Animals and different criticism they supplied when being displayed at different institutions and spaces. That part of the talk blew my mind. So the last term that I plan to briefly discuss is text or language, which intrinsically responds to the phenomenon of translation. I have talked about the linguistic punning surrounding the names of the zodiac animals. In addition, Patricia introduces two more intriguing cases that show us the power of language, or the power of text. And interestingly, they're both about vandalism. The first is the 1931 article on the destruction of the Yuanmingyuan, where the author translated the term vandalism phonetically into fanda, which literally means arrival of the foreigners. And the second moment is again the vandalism at Jiayi in Taiwan, which led to the wordplay by Taiwanese media centering around different homophones of the Chinese term for the zodiac hats, 兽兽. As we all know, the Chinese language is a quintessential vehicle for the construction and dissemination of cultural and intellectual identities. Also, the relatively consistent and stable expressions of the Chinese language, both written and oral throughout history, afford us a shared proficiency of decoding embedded meanings and messages within the Chinese-speaking community around the world. I dare to state, not based on our friendship, that, to be clear, that Patricia's brilliant research on this topic and her illuminating talk today have added another exciting episodes of the afterlives of these zodiac hats, which will eventually, as I believe, enrich their history or histories. I also believe that Patricia's talk today and our discussion today will significantly and creatively, contribute to the fulfillment of the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum's mission of educating and inspiring by preserving and celebrating the richness of Chinese history, art, and culture, as well as the Chinese Culture Center's agenda of promoting education, understanding, and appreciation of the Chinese language and culture. So that's pretty much what I have to say about Patricia's brilliant talk.
Thank you so much, Yifan. I think I would like to invite Patricia to comment about the discussion's important points. Yes?
Yeah. Thank you, Lily, for letting me respond, and thank you, Yifan, for that beautifully put together kind of analysis of my talk. You're really, I think, being very generous to the content of this talk. But I kind of want to pick up, actually, I think, on your last point about why this is important to present to a Chinese historical society in San Diego. And part of that is that I think for myself, as someone who was born in Los Angeles, in Southern California, as a Chinese American, as a Taiwanese American, and again, we come back to that negotiation of identity, depending on where you are and who you're speaking to, that I have always been drawn, I think, to these kinds of objects that don't seem to fit comfortably into singular categories, but literally move between them, where their value isn't isn't integral to them, but is negotiated, that we give things value and we can take it away as well. So I loved how you really kind of pulled out those strands of negotiation, translation, and text and language, which also feels very relevant to the very format of this talk, of being given in English with Chinese auto-generated subtitles, in a space where we are actually all, again, coming back to kind of site specificity. We're not in the same room together. And maybe this talk would feel different if we were actually all in the same room in San Diego versus coming in from all different kinds of places. And one's not better than the other. It's just going to be different. But I think it really speaks to that importance of place and to space, and to how spaces and places create community or challenge efforts to build community, as we saw in that last example. So I think I'll just leave this here because I want to make sure that our audience also has time for any of their questions and comments, or if they've seen these heads, any versions of them.
Yes. Wonderful. I want to tell you that I actually saw the head in Macau, in the Casino Lisboa. So I did see it. I also want to ask a question of Patricia. Where are the Ai Weiwei's work now being exhibited?
That is a great question. And this is a point I didn't have time to get into in my talk, but there is more than one of Ai Weiwei's bronze set. So actually, in terms of the multiplication of these works, Ai Weiwei himself has sort of multiplied their presence upon the world. So as Yifan said, there is a permanent set at LACMA, the LA County Museum of Art.
Mm-hmm.
The set that was at Princeton is now part of their permanent collection as well, though I don't know where they now have it on their campus. It's not in front of the School for Public, the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy.
Mm-hmm.
There is a set that is in a winery up in Northern California that I know for sure. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a few others that are probably in private collections now. So there's a total of 6 of these sets and 2 artist proofs. And some of them may still be traveling as well. So they're kind of so what's fun about it is that they're also in kind of constant motion around the world. So I encourage all of you to kind of just keep an eye out, because you don't know where you're going to encounter them next.
Mm. That's wonderful. We should keep an eye out on these 12 zodiac animals' heads. Now I'm asking Elizabeth to see if there are questions and comments for the talk and the discussion.
There are many comments, particularly in the tone of, I guess, expressing appreciation for the research behind your talk, Patricia. I noticed a comment from the ambassador of Costa Rica to Republic of China, Elena Wachong, is in the audience. She had a comment. I don't know if she'd like to speak. If not, I can read your comment. She says, thoughtful, well-researched, and objective. It's wonderful to see young scholars tracing the meaning of historical art as interpreted through different periods of history from different cultures and interpretation of opposing military and political views. It makes objects of 1733 remain alive today. To make it a Sherlock Holmes worthy mystery drama is fascinating. Bravo.
Wow. I've never had an ambassador comment upon my work, so I'm going to save this comment for my tenure file.
Yes.
I will also save the chat, and I am happy to send the text of the chat to you.
That would be great. Thank you.
I think there is a friend of Dr. Cheng's who's in the audience, probably tuning in from London, Paula Crowder. She, I guess, like Yifan, she thanks Yifan for your comments, and also mentions that she wishes that Patricia were her teacher, noting that she learned a lot today.
Oh, thank you so much for that very kind comment. I want to kind of come back to some of Yifan's points about how these heads are, and if I may quote from a rather famous anthropologist, that they're good to think with, because they allow us to not just focus on one point, but just with this one really good case study, we've been able to say so many different things. And this is what I teach to my students, that if you can get that really, really good case study, you can say 10 very interesting things rather than say the same thing 10 times. And that's what I love about these heads. They're like the present that keeps on giving.
Our director, Jacinta, I think that she may be in her car. I don't know if you'd like to turn on your microphone, but she wrote a comment in the chat box mentioning that she was able to see the heads in the planetarium in 2014. That she feels, I guess she's able, kind of thinking back on that, she's able to have more context given the information that you shared in your talk.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. Really appreciated. This is so enlightening. I think I had never heard of this before, seeing the heads at the Adler Planetarium as a native Chicagoan. And even then, I didn't know the context behind the statues themselves. I thought they were fascinating as a Chinese zodiac, but being able to hear this history and this narrative really puts a different perspective on it. So we thank you so much on behalf of the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum to come and do this talk for us.
Thank you, Jacinta. And it's so nice to finally meet you, albeit digitally. I hope your tenure as executive director is going really, really well. I think this is also what is so fascinating about the Ai Weiwei heads and how they're so effective as public installation is that they're able to kind of meet people on all kinds of different levels, right? That you can encounter them with very little knowledge and still derive the joy of seeing the Chinese zodiac and finding the one that relates to you personally. And then the more you learn about it, the more you get these additional kind of layers of history written over them and into them, and kind of really opens up a lot more, I think, conversations. But it's also very, I think, interesting for me to hear about people's encounters with the Ai Weiwei heads, because I think it's also interesting to think about these institutions that have displayed them and the kind of information that they're choosing to put out in terms of brochures or wall text about these heads and why they have it there in their institution.
Yeah, I also would like for you to elaborate just a little bit before we end this program about the construction of Yuan Mingyuan. Who were the architects? Why was Yuan Mingyuan so different from a Suzhou garden? Would you be kind enough to at least share some of your knowledge about Yuan Mingyuan?
Yes, let's see if I can do this in less than an hour. So the Yuan Mingyuan is probably about the size of Central Park in New York today, give or take. And it begins construction in 1709, actually as a gift for who will then become the Yongzhen Emperor. So it actually starts out first as the Yongzhen Emperor's garden. And in terms of sort of like who's the architect, there's no title of architect in China at this particular point, but there are certainly builders who are actually in some ways constructing lots of mini Suzhou gardens put together. And so the real key distinction between a Qing imperial garden and those of the smaller ones that we see down south is that actually when emperors like Kangxi and Qianlong go on their southern tours down into the south, they're like, wow, I really like this garden. And actually, Yifan can speak about this too, because I know you did research on the Shiziling, the Lions Grove Garden and its Qing Dynasty replicas. So then for Qianlong, he wants to actually copy these smaller gardens into his larger imperial garden. So we kind of talk about Yuan Mingyuan as like gardens within gardens. And other scholars of garden landscape history and architectural history will describe and characterize the Yuan Mingyuan as an imperial microcosm, that the rest of the Qing Empire is kind of bits and pieces of it are picked up and then replicated within the space of the garden itself. That's kind of the very short answer. And I have a whole nother 50-minute long lecture that I give to my students about the history and microcosmic nature of the Yuanmingyuan. But the Yuanmingyuan was both a site of leisure, a site to kind of get away from the stuffiness of the Forbidden City, but it was also a site of government and administration that Qianlong received many foreign missions inside the Yuanmingyuan. And it was also a workshop site that many of the Jesuit artists worked in one of the workshop spaces in the Yuanmingyuan as well.
Yes. Thank you very much, because I read about the Jesuit priests designing a set of features. They were not the animals first, they were other types, more Western styles. But in any event, we don't have them anymore in Beijing. We can only use our imagination about the glorious days when the clock struck 12. All the animals would be sprouting water, and that sight must be very beautiful. So I want to make sure that we still have time for any comment or answer at this or questions at this time. Do you have any more from Elizabeth?
Well, this is a question from a former volunteer at the museum, Jeff Trace.
Mhm.
He asks if I could ask of you, Professor Yu, if you allow auditors in your classes at Kenyon. He would be interested to come to Ohio.
At the moment, I have two former students of mine who are auditing my Art of Japan class. I personally have no objection if someone wants to drive out to Central Ohio and come sit in my classroom, as long as there are seats available. That would be fine by me. It's a long way to come to go back to school, but you're welcome to do so.
Thank you so much. That's such a compliment to you. Patricia, you are an assistant professor. I am sure you will be applying for promotion. Are you tenured?
I am tenure track, and I am actually undergoing pre-tenure review this year.
Yes, we will be happy to supply our support to your tenure and promotion and applications. But I want to take a moment to thank everybody for joining us. As you know, we do have people from outside of the United States, from South America, from Europe, joining us. So this is a very impressive group of people, and they were so impressed with you, Patricia, and very impressed, of course, with Yifan. And I wish you the best of luck, Yifan, for your research, and hopefully you'll be able to share your research on the Chinese art between 1949 and 1970. And we hope to welcome you back also, Patricia, for another presentation on your subjects of interest. And I want to thank everybody for participating today. And we're going to say goodbye for the moment. Happy Halloween. Think about the Zodiac heads while you are moving about, trick-or-treating. And thank you all for joining us today. See you all later. Bye.
Thank you so much.
There was one last question that came up just as we were saying goodbye, from a person named Alan M. Asking if the heads are still being searched, the 5 missing heads are still being searched for.
Yes, I saw that question come in right at the very end. To my knowledge, I can't point you to any specific person or organization who is actively searching for them, although I do believe there are kind of citizens brigades in China that sometimes go around to different museums and take notes on what looks like imperial level objects that shouldn't be in in America or Europe. Do we know if they're going to appear at some future auction? We really don't know, because as far as I've been able to tell, the other 5 heads have really not surfaced in any meaningful way. There are occasionally rumors of them around, but never substantiated. So who knows if they are in someone's attic or basement, or if they have long been melted down and turned into other things. So this is, I think, going to be kind of an ongoing project where every few years we could add another few paragraphs to this research.
Yeah. So the lives of the Zodiac goes on. The lives all go on. Yeah. Anyway, do we have any comments about the whole session? Do you feel comfortable? Everything ran smoothly?
It went smoothly for me. I was a little worried that I was running a bit long towards the end there, but it seemed like everyone was able to follow the thread,
Yes.
so I think it's okay.
Yeah. I usually would remind the speakers if they are going for too long a time. But since I know your slides, I know you're approaching the end, so no problem. And I think both of you, Yifan and Patricia, enjoy each other's company and comments and actually dialogue going back and forth. So it's very, very nice. So we hope to definitely invite you back in a later time for another topic, something that you have been researching or something that you are currently working on. But rest assured, we will supply a very nice letter to both of you if you can give us your official address, so we can address them with our museum's logo and with our university logo. Okay, and that will happen. And all I need is for you, Muting and Elizabeth, to work out the logistics to get those letters to you. Okay.
Yes. Oh, I see
Yeah.
a quick comment from.
Elizabeth.
Oh, yes, William Ma was in the audience, and he's already texted me.
William Ma, yes, very good. Yeah,
Yes.
I
And
met
William,
him in
he
person.
knows all of us.
Patricia, did you see Sarah Larson in the audience?
Oh, I didn't.
I did.
Yeah, I saw her.
Very nice. Yeah.
She was there.
Yeah. So how far are you from each other? Kenyon to the
1
Kenyon
hour
College
drive?
too? Huh?
Is it 1 hour drive?
1 hour.
Oh,
Yeah.
you're pretty close. Are you close to Cleveland?
2 hours.
2 hours. Oh, okay.
Hours.
So yeah, Jeff Trace was a volunteer for our museum, and then he is now in Boston, and he did a presentation for us about his about Tangshanzang, about the journey to the West, and he is always interested in learning more. So if he is willing to drive from Boston to Ohio, why not? Yeah.
Maybe via Zoom if it's still do be hybrid.
Yeah, we're not doing hybrid anymore because it's a small liberal arts college, so everything's in person.
In person. Yeah. I think most colleges are doing in person, no hybrid. Yeah, but in any event, I want to thank you. Have a great afternoon. I know it's already 3:30, right?
It's 2:30.
2:30. So you're okay. You still have half of the afternoon to go around, and we will just take care of our own lunch soon. And if you don't mind, Elizabeth and Muting, can you stay on a little bit? But we want to say goodbye and thank you to Patricia and Yifan. All right?
All right. Thank you all
you,
so much.
Patricia,
Hope to
Yifan.
see you in
See you
person
soon.
soon.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
So, bye.
Thanks.
So, yeah. So Elizabeth, with the lecture series